Imagine Paris during the Belle Époque, a city glittering with light, art, and endless possibilities. The streets buzzed with energy, cafes were filled with laughter, and artists were painting the future with bold, revolutionary strokes. It was an era of breathtaking beauty and brilliance. But behind this dazzling facade, a darker truth simmered. For many of these creative souls, the pursuit of genius came at a heavy price. Absinthe, the infamous green fairy, promised inspiration and escape but often delivered despair, blurring the line between creativity and self-destruction. The nights were long, fueled by obsession, and the pressure to create something truly magnificent was immense. These masterpieces we still admire today were born not just from talent, but from the fragile, haunted spirits of those who risked everything for their art. It was an age where beauty and sorrow danced hand in hand. They called Belle Époque France a golden age, a time of glittering cafes, velvet theaters, and electric lights, a time when dreams bloomed across Paris like spring flowers. But every golden age has shadows. Beneath the chandeliers and laughter lived a different world, a world painted green, a world where artists chased visions instead of sleep, where poets tried to touch God through a glass, and where the brightest minds slowly faded into ghosts while the city applauded their genius. This is the story of the dreamers who believed absinthe could unlock their souls, but instead watched it quietly consume them. Paris, at the turn of the 20th century, felt intoxicating even without a drink. Painters filled Montmartre with canvases, musicians filled salons with sound, and every café table seemed to hold a genius arguing about love, philosophy, and the future of art. But creativity is cruel. Inspiration does not come politely, it arrives violently, demands sacrifice, and refuses to leave unless fed. And many artists believed absinthe was the offering it wanted. They didn't drink it like wine, they worshipped it. They created rituals around it, pouring it over a sugar cube, watching the emerald liquid turn cloudy like magic, and then swallowing it like a promise. They called it la fée verte, the green fairy, a muse, a companion, a destroyer. Absinthe was not just a drink, it became a symbol of rebellion, elegance, and danger. To drink it meant you belonged to the artistic world. It meant you were bold enough to taste madness and sophisticated enough to pretend it was poetry. Posters advertised it with stunning beauty. Cafés displayed it proudly. Writers romanticized it until the world believed inspiration lived inside the bottle. Some claimed it sharpened imagination. Others said it opened doors inside the mind that reality had locked. But no door opens without cost, and once opened, some never closed again. Inside smoky Parisian bars, you would find men staring into their glasses as if waiting for answers. Painters with trembling hands, poets with sleepless eyes, musicians who believed the green haze wrapped around them like a blessing. Conversations grew slower, laughter louder, thoughts stranger. Hours disappeared, nights stretched longer, and mornings came with headaches, shaking fingers, and a growing dependence they pretended was passion. Absinthe promised dreams, but it delivered illusions. It promised genius, but it slowly erased stability, sanity, and in many cases, life itself. There were artists who insisted they worked better while drifting away. They believed absinthe stripped away fear and allowed raw imagination to take control. Sometimes it looked true. They produced masterpieces. They wrote lines history still remembers. The world praised them. But what no one applauded was the price they paid when the applause ended. Behind closed doors came hallucinations, paranoia, and emotional collapse. Some felt as if the world warped, colors bending unnaturally, shadows whispering thoughts the mind never created, and memories slipping like sand through trembling fingers. And instead of stepping back, many poured another glass, hoping the same poison that caused the storm could calm it. Parisian culture didn't discourage them. Instead, it celebrated their suffering as a romantic tragedy. Society adored the image of the tortured genius, the fragile soul, too bright for normal life. Pain was turned into aesthetic beauty. Struggle became an artistic badge. But suffering is not glamorous when you're the one living it. It is lonely, it is frightening, it is slow. Many artists walked into the bar as visionaries and walked out as fading versions of themselves. The cafes full of laughter became silent prisons of obsession. What once felt like inspiration became dependency. The green fairy they loved became a shadow they could not escape. Doctors began warning Europe. Newspapers whispered of scandals. Families broke apart. Careers collapsed. Yet even as the truth grew louder, the myth grew stronger. People loved beautiful lies more than uncomfortable truths. And Absinthe was the most beautiful lie of Belle Époque France. In paintings, it looked elegant. In literature, it sounded poetic. But in real life, it ruined minds and lived silently, without drama, slowly tightening its grip while the victim kept insisting they were in control. It wasn't an instant tragedy. It was tragedy disguised as creativity, moving gently, unnoticed, until nothing remained. What makes this story so heartbreaking is not just the addiction, but the emotional reality behind it. Many artists weren't simply reckless, they were desperate. They felt an immense pressure to be brilliant, constantly. Paris expected greatness from them every single day. But inspiration doesn't work on a schedule, so they tried to force it. Absinthe became a shortcut to what they believed genius should feel like. They didn't just want to succeed, they needed to matter. They wanted to leave something behind, something eternal. And when the fear of failure grew stronger than reason, they poured another glass. The cafés of Paris were not just bars, they were stages where fragile minds performed confidence. The world saw glamour. The artists felt exhaustion. Their smiles weren't always joy, they were masks, hiding uncertainty, fear, and internal chaos. Late-night conversations often ended not with laughter, but with quiet staring, drifting thoughts, and unspoken sadness. The people we remember as legends were human beings fighting battles no amount of applause could cure. They searched for peace in a bottle and instead found deeper chaos. Eventually, Europe could not ignore what was happening. The stories spread. Health problems rose. Tragedies mounted. Absinthe's beautiful reputation cracked, and beneath it appeared the reality: addiction, psychological damage, and lives unraveling silently across the continent. Governments responded. Restrictions grew. The warnings became louder. And finally, the bans began. Cafés lost their signature drink. The posters came down. The rituals ended. The green fairy was chased out of Paris, but not before leaving scars on history and on the souls of those who had trusted her. And when Absinthe faded, something remarkable happened. Artists still created, poets still wrote, painters still painted, music still filled the air. Creativity had never lived in the bottle. It had always lived in them. It always does. The myth collapsed, and the truth remained. Genius is not crafted by intoxication. It is born from discipline, vision, struggle, and human experience. Many learned this too late. Some never lived long enough to understand it at all. So when we romanticize Belle Époque France, when we admire its beauty, its elegance, its music, poetry, and unforgettable art, we should also remember the unseen cost. Behind the glowing café lamps were tired eyes. Behind the masterpieces were trembling hands. Behind the legends were human hearts breaking quietly. History loves to celebrate brilliance, but rarely pauses to honor the pain behind it. Yet that is where the real human story lives. The tragic artists of the Belle Époque were not just symbols of beauty and madness. They were warnings wrapped in elegance, reminders that even the brightest eras cast shadows, and proof that glamorized destruction is still destruction. They remind us that chasing dreams is beautiful, but losing yourself while chasing them is not. And in the quiet corners of Paris, where their ghosts still seem to linger, the city remembers not just their art, but the silent price they paid to create it. Paris did not simply live through its nights, it performed them. As evening settled, the city transformed into a living stage. Every café, every dim alley, every softly glowing window became part of a grand drama. Music drifted through the streets like perfume, laughter rolled across cobblestones, and the air felt thick with possibility. But behind that glittering surface, there was another rhythm, a quieter, slower, heavier pulse that belonged to the dreamers who were beginning to lose their way. They weren't criminals or outsiders. They were the very heart of culture. Painters whose canvases shaped how the world saw beauty. Writers whose words guided our emotions. Musicians who could make a stranger cry without speaking a single word. Yet inside their minds, something was shifting, like a storm slowly rising behind a calm blue sky. Many of them didn't start as tragic figures. They arrived in Paris full of hope, ambition, and a restless excitement. Some came from small towns, their pockets filled with little money, but their heads overflowing with dreams. Others were already known, already praised, but terrified that their success might not last. The city promised endless inspiration, and at first, it delivered. Days were filled with work, discovery, and exploring new artistic courage. Nights were for conversation, for laughter, and for comforting each other when doubt appeared. Life felt intense, meaningful, truly alive, until the pressure quietly grew. In the salons and cafés, creativity wasn't just a private act, it was watched, judged, compared, and constantly measured. Every artist feared becoming ordinary. Every poet feared silence. Every musician feared the day their hands would no longer produce magic. Inspiration, once so natural, began to feel like a responsibility, something they had to prove again and again. And as that fear crept into their lives, Absinthe was already waiting, dressed in elegance and mystery, whispering that it could help, that it could make ideas flow easier, that it could soften fear, loosen thought, and unlock the deepest parts of their imagination. In those moments of insecurity, many of them believed it. Slowly, Absinthe went from an occasional companion to a nightly ritual. It appeared on tables before conversations even began. No one questioned it. It was part of the culture, a symbol of sophistication and brilliance. Friends would encourage each other without realizing they were encouraging dependence. Just one glass to clear the mind, they'd say. One drink to calm the nerves. One taste to feel a little lighter. These words didn't sound dangerous. They sounded comforting, almost supportive. It didn't feel like addiction. It felt like belonging. Like they were part of a powerful secret the ordinary world could never understand. Gradually, little changes began to appear, almost invisible at first. Sleep came later and later. Mornings arrived with dull headaches and tired eyes. Hands trembled slightly. Thoughts wandered more often. Work slowed down. Some days, inspiration would explode beautifully, as if the mind really had been opened. But on other days, nothing came at all, and frustration replaced excitement. When their work felt impossible, many blamed themselves instead of the drink and, to punish themselves for failing. They drank again to try and fix it. It was a soft trap, gentle, silent, a slow tightening of invisible chains. Their conversations changed to where friends once debated dreams and future plans. Something darker slipped in. Their laughter became heavier, their jokes edged with a quiet sadness. They spoke about meaning, emptiness, the fear of fading away, and the strange feeling of watching their own lives drift by, as if they were standing outside of themselves. Late into the night, the city around them slept, but they were wide awake, watching shadows stretch across the walls, while the world inside their minds spun faster than their bodies could handle. And still, they insisted they were fine, that this was normal, that it was all just part of being an artist. There is something deeply human and deeply heartbreaking about the way they held on to that belief. They didn't want to be weak. They didn't want to admit that something they trusted was actually hurting them. They didn't want to disappoint the image the world had of them, the fearless genius, the romantic dreamer, the mysterious soul who lived differently. They convinced themselves that great creativity demanded sacrifice, and if this was the price, they would quietly pay it. Society helped maintain the illusion. Posters continued to glamorize beauty. Magazines praised artistic suffering as something heroic rather than alarming. Patrons admired the drama surrounding the artists almost as much as they admired their work. If someone looked tired, it was called passion. If someone behaved strangely, it was called eccentric genius. If someone struggled, people assumed they would turn that struggle into brilliant work later on. People loved the myth of artistic tragedy so much that they stopped seeing the actual human beings behind it. As weeks and months passed, the effects grew stronger. Some artists became distant, drifting from friends and family, convinced they worked better alone. Some grew emotional and unpredictable, their moods swinging without warning. Some fell into a deep sadness they couldn't explain. Others experienced moments where the world no longer felt solid or real, where sounds echoed strangely, colors looked too bright, or their thoughts became overwhelming, racing too fast to catch. And yet, almost every one of them continued to believe they were still in control. There were still good days, which made everything more confusing. Days where creativity flowed beautifully, where their work felt alive and powerful, where they felt unstoppable. Those days convinced them that everything was fine. But like a tide, those moments would always pull back, leaving an emptiness behind. And when that emptiness came, the bottle was always there, waiting patiently on the table, promising to fill it once again. The city itself didn't notice immediately. Paris continued shining. Parties continued glittering. The music never stopped. While tourists admired the beauty and charm, loneliness lived quietly in crowded rooms. Some artists tried to stop and realized they couldn't. Some hid their struggle behind elegance. Some laughed louder to silence their fear. The world saw sparkle. They felt weight. Yet even in this darkness, there were moments of tenderness. Friends comforted one another. Lovers stayed by each other's side through long, restless nights. Some artists recognized what was happening and desperately tried to save those they cared about, not by shouting or judging, but by simply sitting beside them, by reminding them who they were before they needed a drink to feel alive. History rarely tells these small, gentle stories, but they mattered. They were proof that even in decline, humanity stayed present. Still, the green fairy had woven itself deep into the culture. It wasn't just liquid in a glass. It was identity, ritual, mystery, illusion, escape, and fragile hope all wrapped together. People believed it helped them dream. They just didn't realize they were slowly drifting away from themselves. This was the quiet turning point of the Belle Époque tragedy. Not a dramatic collapse, but a slow fading. Not loud destruction, but a delicate erosion of minds, of confidence, and of inner peace. From the outside, life still looked beautiful. From the inside, something precious was slipping through trembling fingers, and no one yet understood how far it would fall. And Paris, endlessly alive, endlessly enchanting, continued to shine, unaware that within its most brilliant souls, storm clouds were silently gathering, preparing to reshape both their lives and the legacy of an entire artistic age. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health or substance use, please know there is support available. Help is just a phone call or a click away, and reaching out is a sign of incredible strength. We'll leave some resources in the description below. They never realized when the storm began. It didn't crash down with thunder. It arrived like evening shadows, slowly swallowing the light. By the time many artists understood how deeply they were entangled, it was already changing their world in ways they could not reverse. Their thoughts, once so sharp and brilliant, started to grow foggy at the edges. Their confidence wavered. Work that once felt as natural as breathing now felt like climbing a mountain with trembling hands. Each brushstroke took effort. Each sentence felt heavier. Some still produced beautiful work, but it came with pain, exhaustion, and a growing sense that they were racing against something invisible, yet relentless. Nights that once felt adventurous became darker. Instead of excitement, there was uneasiness. Instead of laughter, there were long silences and distant eyes. Some began talking to friends less, not because they didn't care, but because they feared being seen too clearly. Others grew restless, pacing through rooms, unable to sit still, unable to calm their minds. Sleep slipped away like a guest who never intended to stay. Hours stretched on endlessly, and thoughts spun in circles until even reality felt uncertain. They told themselves it was temporary. They told themselves they would regain control. They kept promising, tomorrow will be different. But tomorrow often arrived looking exactly like the day before. The cafés where they once celebrated creativity now witnessed quiet breakdowns disguised as charm. A shaking hand would be laughed off. A strange mood excused as artistic temperament. Society adored the image of the tormented genius so much that it unintentionally protected suffering, wrapping it in romantic language instead of concern. And so the cycle continued, beautified from the outside, deeply painful from within. The world loved their art. Few understood what it cost. Inside these souls, battles raged silently. Many artists began fighting themselves. They questioned their worth. They doubted their talent. They feared failure constantly, even when success surrounded them. They carried expectations like a heavy weight on fragile shoulders, terrified to disappoint audiences, critics, patrons, or their own reputations. Their creativity had once been freedom. Now it felt like a responsibility they could not escape. Some tried to stop their reliance, at least for a while. They hid bottles, avoided familiar bars, and promised themselves new discipline. A few managed to create distance for days or weeks, but stress, loneliness, and overwhelming pressure always seemed to find them. When emotions grew too heavy, when inspiration felt locked away, they returned to familiar comforts, not because they wanted to fall deeper, but because they didn't know another way to cope. The mind seeks relief, even when that relief is dangerous. That is perhaps the saddest part of their story. Most of them were not reckless, careless, or weak. They were simply human. Humans who felt deeply. Humans who lived inside intense minds that never rested. Humans chasing beauty, meaning, and purpose in a world that demanded constant brilliance. They did not seek destruction. They sought relief. And in that search, they wandered into shadows that slowly changed them. Meanwhile, life in Paris continued to glow brightly. The city did not pause for anyone's suffering. Performances continued. Galleries opened. Literary circles debated. Audiences praised new masterpieces without realizing how much pain lived behind the canvas or the page. Fame did not protect them. Admiration did not heal them. Being celebrated didn't make life easier. Sometimes it made it harder, because everyone expected greatness, while inside, they felt increasingly fragile. Friendships began to fracture under the strain. Some people grew distant, unable to watch someone they loved slowly fade. Others stayed, trying desperately to help, offering comfort, conversation, stability. But even love struggled against the weight of these internal battles. Promises to change were made, apologies repeated. Tears were shed quietly in dim rooms where laughter once lived. Yet the city outside still sparkled, cruelly beautiful, as if unaware of the hearts breaking within it. There were moments when clarity returned, and in those moments, many artists realized how deeply they were drifting away from themselves. They looked at old sketches and saw a bright confidence that now felt foreign. They reread past writing and wondered how their minds had once felt so free. They touched instruments and remembered joy instead of worry. Those realizations hurt because they showed just how much had been lost, not suddenly, but slowly, piece by piece. And yet, even in their darkest periods, creativity never truly disappeared. It transformed. Their art began to reflect their inner struggles. Paintings grew more emotional, shadows deeper, colors heavier. Writing became more introspective, honest, vulnerable, filled with questions about life, identity, and purpose. Music gained a haunting beauty, the kind that comes from souls who have seen too much and still continue. Their suffering did not make them talented, but it undeniably shaped the emotional language of their work. Paris admired the result without fully understanding the experience behind it. For some, this period would eventually pass. Strength would return, health would slowly rebuild. Support from loved ones, time away, and sheer determination helped them rediscover life outside the haze. But others would never fully overcome the storm rising inside them. Some walked too far into the darkness and could not find their way back. Their lives became whispered stories, their names remembered with admiration and sadness. Their legacies wrapped forever in the tragic beauty of what they created and what it cost them. And so, as Belle Époque France continued shining with elegance, refinement, and artistic brilliance, a quieter history ran beneath it, the human story of fragile minds, heavy hearts, and souls searching desperately for peace in a world that celebrated their genius but misunderstood their pain. This gentle tragedy did not roar loudly. It breathed softly through lonely nights, hidden behind elegance and applause. This was the deeper truth of that glittering age. While the world saw brilliance, many of the people who created it were quietly struggling to hold themselves together, hoping that within all the beauty they gave to others, they might someday find a little peace for themselves. If you or someone you know is struggling, please know that help is available and you are not alone. There are resources in the description below where you can find support. In the heart of Paris, during an age gilded with light and laughter, a quiet storm was gathering. While cafés hummed with life and theaters glowed, something beneath the surface was shifting. The very artists who defined the city's joy and creativity were slowly becoming shadows of themselves. Their brilliance still flickered, but the steady warmth that once guided them began to feel distant. They kept moving, kept working, pretending everything was fine, because admitting the truth felt far more terrifying than enduring the struggle. There's a unique loneliness that can exist even in a crowded room, and many of them felt it every day, surrounded by people, yet emotionally adrift. Spoken to constantly, yet quietly unheard. Their smiles were like carefully painted masks, beautiful, convincing, but hiding delicate cracks just beneath the surface. They were admired, applauded, and praised, yet some felt profoundly unseen. Often, those celebrated most loudly carried the heaviest silence inside. On the outside, their lives looked extraordinary. They attended glamorous evenings, sophisticated gatherings, and passionate discussions about art, philosophy, and life. Their names appeared in newspapers. Their work hung proudly on gallery walls or echoed through concert halls. To the world, they seemed powerful, successful, almost untouchable. But inside, every success felt strangely lighter than expected, as if joy no longer reached the depths of their hearts. Each new achievement only reminded them how exhausted they were, trying to keep up with expectations that never seemed to end. There were days when inspiration struck beautifully, and in those hours, they felt alive again. They forgot the fear, the pressure, the battles haunting their minds. Ideas flowed, creativity bloomed, and for a brief moment, life felt almost as it once did, bright, meaningful, and hopeful. These moments were precious, but as time passed, they grew rarer. Instead of being a part of everyday life, they became exceptions. When they faded, many artists were left chasing the memory of a self they no longer recognized. Friendships in this era became both lifelines and silent tragedies. Friends watched one another struggle, desperate to help but unsure how. No one wanted to push too hard, to offend, or to lose someone they loved. So they stayed close, offering comfort, reassurance, and understanding. They listened to fears and wiped away tears that others never saw. They carried these emotional burdens in secret, because the world preferred the romantic image of the passionate artist over the reality of a vulnerable human being. In private spaces, far from the glittering Paris nights, the real battles unfolded. There were quiet talks at small tables, honest confessions whispered in trembling voices, and promises made under dim lamps that tomorrow would be different. There were long nights spent trying to write, paint, or play music while hands shook and minds wandered. There were moments of anger at themselves, at their own perceived weaknesses, at fate, and at the societal myth that artists must suffer to create. Many hated that myth because they were living inside it, not as poetry, but as pain. Still, hope never completely died. The human heart rarely surrenders entirely. Many artists fought with everything they had to reclaim themselves. They changed their routines. They tried new environments. Some left Paris for a while, searching for quieter places where their minds could finally breathe. Others sought help in the limited ways their time allowed, turning to doctors, friends, or loved ones for support. Some began to create more slowly, more gently, refusing to rush their creativity. They started valuing peace more than praise, and well-being more than applause. And something remarkable happened in these attempts to heal. Their art changed again. This time, it wasn't born from suffering, but from honesty. Their work began to reflect resilience, a longing for peace, and the courage to face fear rather than run from it. Their creations became deeper, richer, filled not only with darkness but with understanding. Art stopped being merely beautiful. It became profoundly human. It carried warmth, sadness, strength, vulnerability, and truth in equal measure. Yet not everyone could escape the weight they carried. For some, exhaustion eventually overpowered hope. Their health weakened. Their minds struggled harder against the restlessness, the emotional turbulence, and the endless internal noise. A few artists faded slowly from the world, not dramatically or loudly, but gently, like lights dimming until they finally disappeared. Their absence left spaces that Paris could feel deeply, even if society couldn't always understand the full story behind their loss. History later remembered many of them as tragic legends. Their names became symbols of brilliance touched by sorrow. People romanticized their struggles, turning their pain into a poetic mystery instead of acknowledging the human suffering it truly was. Statues, museum rooms, and literature immortalized them, but often without the empathy they deserved while they were alive. They were loved for their work, but they needed to be loved for themselves. And what of Paris? The city continued breathing beauty. Generations passed, streets changed, and the lights evolved. But the emotional echo of that era never vanished. It lingers in paintings hanging silently in galleries, where the colors still hold whispers of sleepless nights. It lives in poems and novels filled with longing and depth. It resonates in music whose notes still tremble with human vulnerability. Their struggles shaped culture far beyond their own lifetimes. Belle Époque France is remembered as an age of elegance, creativity, and cultural brilliance, and it truly was. But beneath that beauty lived fragile hearts, extraordinary minds wrestling with extraordinary pressures, and souls searching for peace in a world that demanded perfection while glamorizing their suffering. They loved deeply, hurt quietly, created passionately, and lived intensely, leaving behind not only masterpieces but powerful reminders of what it means to be human. The truest story of that glittering age is not simply one of glamour or tragedy, but of resilience, tenderness, connection, and the eternal struggle between light and shadow within the human spirit. It is a story of people who gave the world beauty while fighting battles the world rarely saw. It's a reminder that behind every masterpiece lies a living, feeling soul, one that deserves our understanding, compassion, and care just as much as our admiration. If you or someone you know is struggling, please know you are not alone. There are resources available, and reaching out is a sign of strength. We've included some links in the description below. When we look back at Belle Époque Paris, it's easy to see a perfect, frozen scene. Sparkling lights, elegant fashion, vibrant cafes, and a creative energy that defined an era. But life is never a still painting. It's movement, conflict, and slow transformation. For the artists caught in this emotional storm, their story wasn't just about tragedy. Many lived in that delicate space between breaking and surviving, between fading and fighting. This wasn't just a story of loss. It was a story of endurance. As the years unfolded, the artistic world began to change. Success was no longer enough to hide inner turmoil. Society started to see the cracks in its own golden dream. Friends spoke more openly, daring to express concern instead of just admiration. People began to notice exhaustion instead of romantic mystery, and vulnerability instead of dramatic beauty. A new awareness was forming, the understanding that artists weren't magical beings. They were people, deeply sensitive and deserving of emotional care. Inside their homes, away from the public eye, many artists reached a turning point. There is a moment in suffering when you either sink further or begin to climb back toward yourself. For some, it came quietly while staring at an unfinished canvas, feeling a tiredness too heavy to ignore. For others, it came painfully, after watching relationships strain under the weight of their struggles. There was no single path, just a slow realization that they couldn't keep living trapped inside their own minds. And so began one of the most human phases of this era, the attempt to heal. Healing, however, was never simple. These artists lived in a time when emotional health was barely understood. Many had no access to meaningful help, relying instead on willpower, their environment, and human connection. Some escaped Paris, seeking silence in the countryside, fresh air instead of smoke-filled rooms, sunlight instead of dim cafe corners. They needed space from the city that both inspired and exhausted them. Others stayed but changed how they lived. They avoided the cafes where old habits waited, spending more time alone or with trusted friends rather than in large, performative gatherings. They learned to value quiet moments, to slow their minds instead of constantly pushing them. They began to understand that creativity could exist without chaos, that great art didn't require pain as its price. And slowly, something beautiful began to happen. They rediscovered simple human experiences, peaceful mornings, long walks, genuine laughter. Their hands steadied. Their thoughts became clearer. Where once there was desperation, acceptance began to grow. Where there was fear, patience. Their art transformed again, this time not from chaos, but from clarity. Their work gained a new depth, reflecting wisdom and emotional honesty. It was gentler, more grounded, more human. This shift didn't erase what they had endured, but it gave meaning to their survival. Meanwhile, Paris itself started to evolve. The glamorous myth of beautiful suffering began to feel less enchanting as people witnessed its true cost. Society slowly learned that genius shouldn't be built on broken minds. That realization didn't change everything overnight. Culture changes slowly, but it planted seeds. The world began to understand that creativity and mental health weren't enemies. They needed each other. Yet, despite these hopeful changes, some could not escape their inner storms. They never fully recovered, their spirits too tired after fighting for so long. They continued living quietly, half present in the world, half lost within themselves. Their lives weren't dramatic tragedies or triumphant victories. They were simply human stories suspended in the middle, where not every battle ends cleanly. And still, they mattered. Every artist of this era, whether they broke, survived, or hovered somewhere in between, shaped the emotional language of their time. They pushed culture forward not only with their brilliance, but with their vulnerability. Their lives forced society to ask uncomfortable questions. What do we expect from those who create beauty for us? And why do we romanticize suffering instead of trying to prevent it? Years later, when people look back, they remember the glamour and the art. But beneath that shimmer is another truth, the truth of fragile minds, quiet resilience, and the deeply human hearts that struggled while giving the world unforgettable beauty. These artists were never just symbols, they were people. Their story isn't only about absinthe and tragic decline, it's about perseverance and the delicate balance between creativity and humanity. It's about learning that brilliance should never demand the destruction of the person who carries it. Perhaps their most powerful legacy wasn't just their art, but the silent message woven into their lives. Greatness doesn't come from suffering. It comes from feeling deeply, enduring, and daring to remain human in a world that often prefers beautiful illusions over uncomfortable truth. As their era moved forward, Paris still glowed, the lights still shimmered, but somewhere beneath all that beauty, there was a new awareness, a quiet respect for the human heart behind every masterpiece. The nights of Paris had become a strange theater of contradictions. On one side, the city glowed with brilliance, with laughter, music, and the promise of immortality through art. But on the other, an invisible heaviness pressed down on every soul wandering the cafés and studios. As the years of the Belle Époque rolled forward, its glamour began to reveal a cruel truth. Beauty in this world often demands a cost, and it was almost always paid in silence, suffering, and unseen tears. The artists who once believed Absinthe helped them touch the divine now realized it was stealing the very life that allowed them to dream. They woke with trembling hands, their visions blurry instead of inspired. Their nights grew longer, and their mornings filled with a quiet dread. What began as a muse now felt like chains, yet escaping those chains felt even harder than living with them. In the smoky corners of Montmartre, you could hear confessions whispered between exhausted breaths. A painter would stare at his unfinished canvas and quietly say he no longer recognized the person holding the brush. A poet who once wrote verses of golden hope now ripped his pages apart because he could no longer find beauty, only confusion and shadows. The cafés that once felt so warm and electric started to feel like emotional graveyards, where broken dreams sat silently beside half-empty glasses. The joy was still there on the surface, for the audience, for the outsiders, for the city that loved the myth of the tortured genius. But underneath, the artists were slowly fading, their souls exhausted from pretending to be enchanted when, in truth, they were lost. Yet, even in this darkness, something deeply human was happening. Paris was teaching them that creativity was never meant to be forced by illusions or chemical escape. True art, the kind that touches hearts for generations, comes not from self-destruction, but from surviving it. Slowly, very slowly, some artists began to realize that what they truly needed wasn't another glass of hallucinated inspiration. They needed peace, rest, clarity, and forgiveness toward themselves. They needed to understand that their worth didn't depend on suffering, that genius wasn't proven by pain, and that no drink could create real greatness. Cliff could only distort it. But recognizing this truth didn't instantly bring salvation. It began with quiet battles inside the mind. Nights spent staring out of studio windows, wondering where life had gone. Moments of deep regret as memories replayed, showing friendships that had faded, opportunities lost, and smiles that had disappeared. Paris was still beautiful, but now its beauty felt like a reminder of what they could not fully touch anymore. The cafés buzzed with laughter, but some sat silently among the noise, feeling like ghosts in a city that had once welcomed them with open arms. The music still played, the stars still sparkled above the rooftops, but inside, many hearts beat with fear instead of wonder. This is also where resilience slowly began to grow. Some chose to step away from the green drink that once felt so magical. Some chose to find strength in companionship instead of loneliness, in genuine creativity instead of forced brilliance. The conversations began to shift. Instead of romanticizing struggle, some finally spoke honestly about it. They started to accept that artists were human, not mythical beings destined to burn out for entertainment. They deserved to live, to breathe, to find joy without destruction. And although many were lost forever, those who survived carried a new understanding. The Belle Époque wasn't only about shining lights and famous names. It was about fragile humans trying desperately to matter in a world that loved their art more than their well-being. The city changed slowly with them. The mystique of Absinthe lost some of its charm as reality became impossible to hide. Doctors began to issue warnings, newspapers whispered the truth, and society started to question whether glorifying suffering was ever worth the masterpieces it produced. The image of the genius staring dramatically into a glass began to feel tragic instead of romantic. Paris remained a city of dreams, yes, but now, people began to understand that dreams should not require a life as sacrifice. The cafés still glowed at night, but within that glow now lived caution, reflection, and the quiet hope that future artists might find a kinder path than those who came before. And still, the story of Belle Époque France remains powerful, not because of the illusions, but because of the humans behind them. The painters with trembling hands, who still tried to create beauty. The poets, who, even in despair, searched for words that could heal. The musicians who continued to play, hoping their melodies might guide someone away from the same darkness. Their struggles did not erase their brilliance. Instead, Their survival, their honesty, and their vulnerability became part of their legacy. They taught the world that art born from truth lasts longer than art born from escape. And as the era slowly moved toward its final years, Paris stood as a reminder of both the danger of chasing illusions and the extraordinary strength of those who dared to face reality again. If you or someone you know is struggling, please know that support is available. Reaching out is a sign of incredible strength. We've included some resources in the description below. Have you ever stood in a theater after the final act? The curtain is still bright, the stage still holds a faint warmth, but the performers are gone, quietly exhausted behind the scenes. That's what Paris felt like as the dazzling illusions of the Belle Époque began to tremble. It wasn't because the city had lost its beauty, but because its artists, the painters, poets, and musicians who gave it life, were starting to see what that beauty truly cost. The cafés still buzzed with voices, laughter still drifted into the night air, and music still echoed from glowing rooms. But beneath the glittering lights lived stories of survival, regret, courage, and fragile hope. This was no longer the Paris of blind enchantment. It was a city where fantasy was forced to meet consequence, and where the dreamers were learning that staying alive was the greatest act of defiance. There were nights you could walk through Montmartre and feel the weight of unspoken truths floating in the air like mist. The loud, wild conversations about fearless ambition and exaggerated confidence had softened. Pain had taught these artists humility. Instead of bragging about grand visions and drinking inspiration from green-tinted glasses of absinthe, they began to speak about quiet fears, about feeling lost, about waking up unsure of who they were becoming. And that honesty, unexpected and raw, did something powerful. It connected them in a way illusions never could. Where false unity was once forged in haze, real companionship was now created through vulnerability. They started to see each other not as rivals for fame, but as fellow survivors. And in this new, fragile honesty, some began to heal in small, almost invisible ways. A painter who used to chase hallucinated colors in the dead of night now sat by his window, letting real, warm sunlight fall onto his canvas again. He was rediscovering the world as it was, not as his tormented mind imagined it. A poet who once drowned his sorrows in sleepless nights began walking through Paris at dawn. He found his verses not in chaos, but in the quiet pulse of the city, waking up the gentle footsteps of workers, the smell of fresh bread from a bakery, the soft blue sky slowly turning bright. A musician, who had once played with a violent desperation, as if trying to outrun his own mind, now learned to play slowly. He let every note breathe. He was no longer forcing brilliance from his suffering. He was finding peace in the melody. These weren't grand, dramatic victories. They didn't suddenly erase the damage or the pain, but they were beginnings. They were quiet moments where life was gently returning to places where darkness had once ruled. They were proof that even after the storm, something could grow again. And yet, healing was never a simple, straight line. For every soul that reclaimed a piece of themselves, another struggled in silence. Paris was a city of stark contrasts, where success and collapse lived side by side on the very same cobblestone streets. There were still those who couldn't escape their inner storms, who felt trapped between the immense pressure to be a genius and the terrifying fear of being ordinary. Some clung to their illusions because they felt safer than reality. The world expected greatness from them, and they no longer trusted who they were without the mask of the tortured artist. They continued to chase the green fairy, hoping to find an escape that never truly came. Their stories are just as much a part of this era. Their presence was a constant, heartbreaking reminder that history's beauty often hides a world of unseen grief. Behind every celebrated masterpiece, there was a real human being who bled quietly into their work, sometimes without anyone ever truly noticing the sacrifice. Paris itself seemed to sense this profound shift. The Belle Époque, once painted purely as a golden age of elegance and pleasure, began to reveal its deeper, more complicated truth. It was an era of fragile brilliance, built by fragile people. The posters on the walls still showed smiling performers, the shimmering theaters still welcomed eager crowds, and the cabarets still sparkled with an electric energy. But society was slowly, hesitantly, beginning to look beyond the spectacle. Writers started to critique the romantic idea of suffering for art. Thinkers began to question the dangerous myth that pain was a necessary ingredient for greatness. There were no sudden, sweeping changes, but seeds were planted, small seeds of understanding that would grow over time, changing how we think about creativity and the human cost behind it. History would remember these quiet beginnings. Through all of this turmoil and transformation, the artists themselves carried something profound. They began to understand that their work mattered, not just because it dazzled the world, but because it came from a place of real, raw human experience. Their paintings weren't magical because of some mystical illusion. They were magical because a trembling hand still chose to pick up a brush and create there. Poetry wasn't powerful because it was written at the edge of collapse. It was powerful because, even with a broken heart, they still reached for meaning and connection. Their music wasn't moving because they suffered. It was moving because they survived long enough to share their voice with the world. Humanity, not myth, was the true, enduring source of their brilliance. And so, Paris entered a quieter, more thoughtful, emotional chapter. The nights still held their beauty, but it was a softer beauty, now less wild, more reflective. There were evenings when artists would sit together not to escape life, but simply to share it, to talk, to listen, to just be present with one another. Laughter returned, but in a gentler form. It wasn't loud and reckless anymore. It was warm and sincere, born from a shared sense of relief. Friendships became lifelines instead of mere distractions. Studios that were once filled with frantic, chaotic energy began to feel like sanctuaries again, places of safety and quiet creation. Slowly, bit by bit, Paris stopped being a city of dreamers running away from themselves. It became a city of dreamers learning to face themselves, with all their flaws and all their fears, and finding a new kind of courage in that honesty. It was a painful, difficult transformation, but it was a necessary one. The city was growing up, and its artists were growing with it. Years later, when historians looked back at Belle Époque France, they would remember the art, the colors, the music, the revolutionary creativity that changed the world. But beneath every famous name, beneath every celebrated masterpiece, lived the quieter truth that this era etched into history. Brilliance is not a performance. Genius is not a sacrifice. And beauty that is gained by destroying oneself is never truly beauty at all. What made this period so unforgettable wasn't just what the artists created, but what they endured. It was what they overcame, and what they taught the world about the real, vulnerable humanity that exists behind every legend. The city of Paris remained standing, not as a monument to fleeting illusions, but as a powerful testament to resilience. It continued to shine, not because it hid its shadows, but because it had learned to exist alongside them, acknowledging that light and dark are both part of the same story. And the artists, those fragile souls once lost in green-tinted dreams, became symbols of something far more powerful than fantasy. They became symbols of survival, of truth, and of the unbreakable strength of the human spirit, always trying, again and again, to find meaning and create beauty in a world that never stops asking for more. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the heart of history. There comes a point in every golden age when people start to wonder if it was ever truly golden. Think of the Belle Époque in France, the beautiful era. We've painted it in endless layers of celebration, glittering cafés, revolutionary art, theaters bursting with spectacle, and laughter echoing through smoke-filled rooms. It was a time of magic, but as the years passed, those who lived through it and those who came after began to peel back those layers. What they found underneath wasn't just beauty and brilliance. They found bruises the world had once refused to see. The era began to be remembered not just for its artistic freedom, but as a delicate dance between light and shadow, between enchantment and exhaustion. As Europe marched closer to the great storms of the 20th century, the romantic image of the suffering artist started to lose its shine. New generations looked back and saw how dangerously seductive that myth had been, the idea that pain was glamorous, that destruction was poetic, that losing yourself was somehow noble because it produced great art. They began to understand what the Belle Époque artists themselves had slowly discovered. Suffering didn't create brilliance, it only threatened to silence it forever. The masterpieces that survived were miracles, not because they rose from chaos, but because the people behind them fought desperately to keep living long enough to create them. The old cafés, once home to endless nights of intoxicated dreaming, became historical landmarks. People would visit them, sitting where great minds had once debated, laughed, and broken. They admired the beauty of the past, but now they knew the truth it had tried to hide. Museum halls showcased masterpieces born from sleepless nights and trembling minds, but the plaques beside them started speaking with more honesty. They no longer celebrated destruction as heroism. They acknowledged humanity and fragility. The story shifted. It was no longer they suffered to be great. It became they were great despite their suffering. This change was crucial. It softened history. It gave dignity back to people who had been treated like tragic legends instead of living, breathing humans for far too long. Paris itself changed emotionally. The city had always been two things at once, a sanctuary for dreamers and a labyrinth for the lost. But now, it began to embrace both truths more openly. The world started to understand that creativity doesn't need to drink from darkness to shine. Artists could be brilliant while being healthy. Inspiration didn't have to come from pain. It could come from joy, curiosity, empathy, and life itself. The romanticization of self-destruction slowly loosened its grip, though it never vanished completely. Humanity had learned something from watching too many bright spirits burn out too quickly. But the memories didn't fade. The stories of those early artists still linger like ghosts in the Parisian streets, not to haunt, but to remind. They remind us of how fragile we are, how heavy expectations can be, and how dangerously easy it is to build myths around suffering while ignoring the reality of it. They remind us to treat artists not as symbols or spectacles, but as people. People with hearts, fears, limits, and quiet battles that no amount of applause could ever cure. And in a strange, gentle way, their struggles gave future generations permission to speak honestly about their own. So, the narrative of Belle Époque France evolved. It was no longer just a story of glitter and genius. It became a story of learning, of seeing differently, of recognizing the true cost behind brilliance. Historians began to tell it with more compassion. Writers described not just the glamour of Parisian nights, but the silent, difficult mornings that followed. Documentaries didn't just replay the music and show the paintings. They spoke about the immense weight behind them. The era wasn't diminished by this honesty. It became more meaningful. Truth deepened the beauty instead of destroying it. Time moved on, but the emotional imprint of this period stayed alive in European memory. A quiet gratitude grew for those who created during those years, for those who paid a price that history could never truly repay. Their courage wasn't in how recklessly they lived, but in how earnestly they tried to exist in a world that demanded their creativity like it demanded air. Their tragedy wasn't romantic, it was profoundly human, and their legacy wasn't the myth of the broken genius, but the reminder that every creation we celebrate comes from a real soul we must never, ever ignore. And so, the Belle Époque became more than just a chapter in art history. It became a lesson about illusion and truth. It showed the world how easy it is to worship beauty while forgetting the people who produce it. It revealed how a society can love masterpieces while failing to love the creators themselves. And slowly, century by century, the world tried to become kinder because of it. Conversations about emotional struggle in creative fields grew louder, understanding deepened, compassion matured. The past had quietly guided the future. Paris remained luminous, but now its light carried wisdom instead of denial. The cafés still filled with artists, but the air felt different, less desperate, more grounded. People still chase dreams in this city, still seek inspiration in its streets, but with a deeper awareness of what it means to be a human being first, and a creator second. The myths of glorious suffering faded just enough to let real empathy breathe. And when night falls over Paris now, when lights glow softly over cobblestones and shadows stretch across the quiet corners of Montmartre, it no longer feels like a stage set for a tragedy disguised as beauty. It feels like a place that remembers, that honors, that understands. A city that has carried the stories of fragile hearts and brilliant minds and learned, slowly and painfully, how to speak of them with truth instead of fantasy. After the storms of a beautiful yet painful era passed, the world finally sat quietly and began to ask the most important question of all. What did it truly mean? The artists of the Belle Époque, those dreamers who loved Paris so deeply they allowed themselves to be consumed by it, didn't just vanish into history. They lingered, in memory, in brushstrokes and poems and surviving letters, like echoes of laughter in an empty café. And with time, people began to return to their stories, not as entertainment, but as something far more intimate, a mirror, The cafés where they once gathered became symbols of memory. People would sit at those little round tables and imagine what once took place there. Not just the laughter, the passionate debates about art and philosophy, but also the silences, the tired eyes, the desperate moments hidden behind confident smiles. Those spaces became reminders of how thin the line had always been between brilliance and vulnerability. The glamour remained in Paris. Of course it always would, but beneath it lay a newfound gentleness, as if the city itself had grown older and wiser. Society slowly learned to speak differently about pain. Where once the world celebrated the beautiful tragedy of the artist, now it spoke with more care. The illusion that suffering automatically created genius began to fade. People started to acknowledge that greatness often happened despite the weight someone carried, not because of it. It was no longer heroic to be broken, it was human. And in that realization, the artists of the Belle Époque were finally given something they had rarely received in their own time: understanding. But history, as always, did not erase everything. The myth could never be completely undone. Yet, it was softened, it was challenged, it was questioned. Instead of being blindly worshipped, it became something to contemplate. The artists who lost themselves were no longer just tragic icons. They were people whose lives quietly asked future generations to treat creativity, talent, and emotional struggle with care. Their legacy became more than art. It became a lesson wrapped in beauty, and Paris itself carried that lesson in the way only a city with a soul could. It was as if the city whispered to all who came seeking dreams: create, imagine, fall in love with life, but do not lose yourself trying to belong to a fantasy. As time moved forward, new generations of artists arrived. They came with different struggles, different dreams, different worlds to face, but they inherited something precious, a more honest narrative. They knew they did not need to shatter themselves to be brilliant. They did not need to chase darkness to find inspiration. They could breathe, exist, and still create beauty. The myth of the suffering genius didn't disappear, but it no longer overshadowed the truth that creativity thrives best when life is allowed to be lived, not sacrificed. The Belle Époque, once remembered purely for its sparkle and decadence, slowly evolved into a fuller story, a story about how easy it is to fall in love with illusions, how dangerously beautiful escape can appear, and how deeply human every artistic miracle truly is. It remained enchanting, but now the enchantment felt grounded in reality, instead of floating weightlessly above it. The dreamlike glow of the era stayed alive, but now it carried shadows honestly, rather than pretending they were glamorous. Their fragility was no longer a spectacle. Their sorrow was no longer decoration. Their struggles were no longer romanticized whispers in smoky rooms. They became part of the truth. And in that truth, something surprisingly beautiful happened. Their humanity became more moving than their myth ever was. Even now, when someone looks at a painting from that era, they may still admire the brilliance of color, the daring brushwork, the emotion bursting from every corner of the canvas. But somewhere deep inside, they also feel something quieter, something softer, silent. Thank you. Time, as it always does, moves on. The city of Paris, with all its glittering lights, smoky cafes, and elegant theaters, continued to live and breathe long after the artists of the Belle Époque had faced their personal storms. Some of them left quietly, their names whispered only in poetry and journals. Their works were cherished, but their struggles remained hidden beneath layers of admiration. Others survived, carrying scars that never fully healed, yet allowing their creativity to continue, becoming steadier, quieter, and wiser. History, of course, remembers the masterpieces, but the true legacy lies not just in what was painted or written, but in the hearts that created it, and the courage it took to endure the unseen battles behind the brush, the pen, and the music. In their struggle, They discovered something fundamental. The world could demand brilliance, but human beings are never built to be unbreakable. They learned, often painfully, that genius isn't measured by the suffering one endures, but by the truths expressed, the beauty shared, and the empathy cultivated. They survived, they fell, they healed in pieces, and through it all, they created. Each moment of creation became a victory over the invisible chains that had bound them, the heavy weight of expectation, the seduction of escape, the quiet torment of a fragile mind. And even when their lives seemed overshadowed by despair, their resilience shone in every line, every note, every single stroke. It became a testament to the power of enduring humanity. The cafés and studios of Paris, once witnesses to endless nights of intoxication and illusion, slowly became places of quiet reflection. Today, students, tourists, and new artists wander those same streets, seeing only the glamour and beauty on the surface. They are often unaware of the hidden pain that quietly shaped the very culture they admire. Yet, beneath every stone, every lamp, every echoing note of music, a memory remains. It's a reminder that every masterpiece carries a human story, and every human story carries a lesson about fragility, courage, and survival. The artist's struggles, once ignored or romanticized, became symbols of a deeper truth, that art and humanity are inseparable. Creation is not proof of invincibility, but proof of endurance. Beauty does not require destruction, and the most important masterpiece anyone can craft is a life that survives, even through darkness. Their lives whisper quietly across time, urging future generations to seek balance, to cherish the fragile heart behind every act of creation. They remind us to understand that behind every great work lies a human being who deserved not only admiration but also care, compassion, and respect. And so, Belle Époque France, remembered for its glamour, elegance, and revolutionary art, remains unforgettable not merely because of its masterpieces, but because of the human courage embedded within them. The world learned, slowly, that the green-tinted illusions were fleeting, but the truth of resilience, of surviving the storms of the mind and soul, is eternal. The artists, once lost in the shadows of their own brilliance, continue to teach us that beauty is not measured in sacrifice, but in endurance. Greatness is not defined by suffering, but by surviving long enough to leave a mark. And even in the darkest nights, a human heart capable of hope can still create a light that outlives time itself. And when the lamps of Paris glow softly over the streets tonight, when shadows stretch across the cobblestones and distant music drifts through the air, the legacy of these fragile, brilliant, surviving souls lingers quietly in every corner. It reminds us that history is not only made in grandeur and applause, but in resilience, in the courage to exist, and in the silent victories of human hearts that refuse to break completely. Their story ends not with a final note or a last brushstroke, but with a quiet truth: enduring, feeling, and creating, even in darkness, is the truest form of beauty and the most unforgettable part of their legacy. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the heart of history.